Okay, so I'm Malcolm Jackson. I'm a professor at the University of Liverpool in the Institute of Life Course and Medical Sciences. And we study aging. In particular, we're interested in the way that we lose muscle and become weak as we get old. And so that's our core area of research. We've been studying that area for a number of years. And recently we've become very interested in the parallels between that and the loss of muscle, which occurs very rapidly in astronauts when they're on the International Space Station or in space trips generally.
What is the link between muscles and aging?
But our muscles, as we get older, what happens is we actually lose some of the muscle fibers. So these are these long cells that run the full length of the muscle. The fibers that remain also atrophy, they get smaller as well. So that's why we become weak as we get older. It's also why older people find it difficult to maintain their balance, and it has a major impact on quality of life of the elderly. Now, exercise is the one thing that we know which will help. But as we've said, it isn't as effective at maintaining muscle mass in older people as it is in young people.
What is the correlation between older people and astronauts?
So we couldn't really figure out a way in which we could get sufficient astronauts doing work which was so well characterized with their muscles that we could compare it to Earth. But we'd also shown a little while ago that we could reproduce this inability to respond from muscles from old people using a cell culture model, so using muscles that we'd actually grown in the lab. And so that's what we decided to do. We decided to actually grow human muscle, small human muscle cells in the lab, to stimulate them, to make them contract, the equivalent of exercise, and to look at how they responded on Earth, and then to fly them to the space station and look at how they responded in the space station.
What is the MicroAge mission?
We noticed that when people first went into space, they came back incredibly weak. And the space agency various space agencies, including NASA, have been looking at what they can do to ameliorate that. And what they do is that the astronauts on the space station exercise for at least 2 hours, sometimes 2.5 hours every day. Despite that, they still come back very weak. And so what we've hypothesized is actually there's a similar phenomena occurring in astronauts in space, but much more rapidly. So they lose this ability to adapt to exercise. So exercise is still good for them, it's still important. But, for instance, Tim Peake, when he returned, couldn't walk when he carried out the capsule that landed in Russia and so on. And so we set about trying to see whether there were any parallels there from which we can understand more about what happens in both situations, but particularly in older people on Earth.
What happened on the International Space Station?
We used a piece of equipment on the space station, which is called a cubic incubator, which keeps everything at body temperature. But also there's a centrifuge in this. And so some of our cells, we could actually induce an artificial gravity in them on the space station as a control to make sure that any changes that occurred in the muscles were only due to the exposure to microgravity. They weren't not the other things that occur when you go into space, like massive vibrations on takeoff, increased exposure to radiation and so on. So that's what we did, and it took us 3 years and funding from the UK Space Agency to get to the point where we managed to miniaturize this system and make it viable so we knew our muscles would survive. And then a team from Liverpool went out to the Kennedy Space Centre at the end of last year, and we were launched on one of these SpaceX rockets, a Falcon 9 rocket, in a resupply mission to the space station on December the 21st. And that was a very exciting time for our team. It was a very young team that was sent out there with postdocs and PhD students. So they worked with the NASA team for 6 weeks to grow our muscle cells, those muscle cells which originally had been obtained in Liverpool, and taken out to NASA, and we grew them up, and then we handed them over to the NASA ground launch team in December, and they flew on the mission. Once they got to the International Space Station, they were taken out of the carrier that they were sent with him and put into this incubator. And a European Space Agency astronaut, Matthias Maurer, and we have film of Matthias Maurer actually taking out the samples and putting them into the incubator. And so they were then switched on, and it went through a fully programmed system of electrical stimulation.
What happened after the samples returned in January?
The samples came down into the Gulf of Mexico. They then they were picked up by helicopter and taken to the Kennedy Space Center, and they were then shipped back to us in Liverpool, frozen back to us in Liverpool. So we've now taken these boxes apart, and we've frozen all of the biological materials, and we've been interrogating the electrical output from the muscles to make sure that that the muscles were contracting properly, that the pumps work properly, and things like that. So we know that now exactly what's happening to each one of these 72 muscles that presented there. And so we've got that information, which couldn't interrogate, and which is telling us things like how strongly the muscles have contracted and whether there was any change with the ones that were in the centrifuge compared to the ones that weren't. The other materials, we've got three different types. We've got some where we're actually looking at the RNA, so this is the genetic changes that occur in the muscle, and they've now gone off to our core facility in Liverpool to analyse the RNA, so that will take a couple of months to come back. We've also got the muscles themselves, so we are doing analysis at this moment of specific proteins which we know are changed in older people, and we suspect will be changed in the muscles that have been in microgravity as well. And then we've also taken the media which surrounds the muscle, and we've done analysis on those, and that's the only bit of biochemical analysis that we're just finishing at the moment. And one of the things that's trying to understand is whether one particular mechanism, inflammation, is actually playing a key role. Because there's a little bit of evidence that certainly in older people, there's something called inflammaging, which is an inflammation that occurs in all of us as we get older. And there's a little bit of evidence that occurs in microgravity as well, with astronauts. And so we're specifically looking at that. And we should have the data on that within the next few weeks. The other data, as I said, about 3 months.
What could the experiment help achieve?
The situation in space where we lose muscle is actually simpler than what happens with aging. With aging on Earth, of course, lots of things happen. People become a little less mobile, their nutrition is usually nowhere near as good, their joints become inflexible so they can't work their muscles well, they're much more they don't do as much exercise, as I said already. There's a sedentary behaviour, so there's much more sitting around. In space, we know that really all that we're exposed to is microgravity. So what we'll be looking for is parallel biochemical and molecular changes which we see in space to those that we see in the muscles of older people. The muscles of older people will be very complex, but there will be at least one component of that which is also reproduced in space. And is then what we will focus on. So what are we then trying to do? You're quite right. We'll be looking to try and find ways of interfering in that process, because that might be pharmacologically, but it might also be different types of exercise. So, one of the things that we suspect is happening in space, for instance, is that actually the amount of tension on the muscles changes because there's no stress on the muscle. And that's also something which we think happens in older people as well, partly because there's some problems with the innervation, so the nervous stimulation of muscle as we age. So we think there will be parallels that we can see there, and we'll be able to extract out the key things that we can then focus on.
Could a breakthrough help us live longer?
There's a government challenge that we should be looking for 5 years extra healthy life for all the people. And that's one of the things that we are trying to address. Now, it's likely that that's not just a muscle problem, although muscle is incredibly important in maintaining everyday mobility. Because, when older people, they tend to get problems with their circulation and lots of other things around aging. It may well be that, of course, there are other parallels between what's going on in space and what occurs in other tissues. So the astronauts, of course, lose bone mass as well. It doesn't exactly look like osteoporosis, but it's a weakening of the bones in a similar way. So we might even identify things about some of the other aspects of aging, as well as what's going on in the muscle itself. The other really interesting area is long COVID as well, in that long COVID manifests itself as a weakness, as an inability to maintain everyday tasks. Again, it looks like that may be worse in older people as well. So we think ageing and the effects of ageing are actually contributing in lots of different circumstances as well. So, being able to find something that's fundamentally changing in ageing and actually then correct it may well have beneficial effects in lots of other situations as well.
What happens next?
What are these key changes that we're seeing, and can we interfere in these changes? And if we can interfere in these changes, do we have drugs? Do we have ways of interfering? Then we'll start doing some tests in our lab to start with in Liverpool on cells in culture to see whether that's correct. And at some stage we may have to go back to the space station to see if we can correct the changes that occur in microgravity. But we've got model systems by which we can look and see whether we can change aging in cells in culture in animal models and then eventually into humans if there's a pharmacological way of trying to do that. So it's likely we'll switch much more back to the aging studies as the first area we can concentrate on.
What does the future hold for space exploration?
But the important thing, when I was being interviewed by the radio, somebody asked me about these entrepreneurs who are actually some of them putting significant amounts of money into aging research, but they tend to be pet projects. And one of the concerns is that they're not funding research which has been fully peer reviewed and everybody agrees it's very high standard and so on. So it's incredibly important. The money is important, but also ensuring that the quality of what is actually being funded is important as well.